Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for really a fascinating and essential journey into the most basic mechanics of your social mind.
That's right.
We are diving deep into social categorization. These are the cognitive shortcuts, that allow your brain to process this incredibly complex world by instantly sorting billions of bits of information into just a few understandable slots.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to understand the automatic, sometimes quite surprising way your brain constructs social reality. We're not talking about conscious malice here or intent.
No, not at all.
We're talking about the deep-seated mental habits needed for, well, efficient survival, essentially. It's the process of forming social groups, of creating an us and a them.
And once those categories are formed, that's it, right?
Yeah.
The beliefs attached to them just guide everything.
Pretty much. They guide all future perception and interaction. It's foundational.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We're focusing on two critical pillars, kind of the main supports for how we build stereotypes. The first is the content of these beliefs.
Right.
What specific characteristics, personality traits, maybe roles, get associated with a particular social group.
And the second pillar, which I often think is more telling, is the process. We need to know precisely how we form these categories in the first place.
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, how those associated characteristics are pulled up from memory, used instantly in real-time interactions, and then, crucially, reinforced over time.
Because that whole process determines if a quick assessment is just efficient or if it's fundamentally biased.
Exactly. The line can be very fine.
Okay, let's start at the very beginning. The basic hardware, if you will. Our minds use a set of basic social categories as the immediate scaffolding for understanding anyone we meet. These are the real fast-track data points.
They are the big three, really. Gender, race, and age.
Yeah.
These categories are just easily observable, right? You see them immediately. They seem information-rich. And they're crucial because they let us instantly draw broad, though sometimes, well, often inaccurate, conclusions.
Conclusions about what, specifically?
About a person's traits, their likely social roles, maybe even physical characteristics. They are truly the initial filter. The first way we organize the social world around us, #tag A, basic categories and subtypes.
But I mean, real life is way more complex than just those three labels, isn't it? Everyone belongs to multiple categories at the same time.
Absolutely.
So a key misconception might be that the brain just picks, like, the most obvious one, but this system is more refined than that, you're saying, thanks to subtypes.
Subtypes are essentially how the brain handles intersectionality, that layering of social identity. So instead of just relying on the broad category, man or Asian, the mind quickly creates a more refined sort of layered category, young Asian man or middle-aged white woman. It adds complexity.
So do these subtypes actually overwrite the initial basic category, or do they just add another layer of detail on top?
They definitely add a layer of detail. They provide more fine-grained judgment and additional information, particularly about specific social roles that those intersecting categories might occupy.
So it doesn't cancel out woman, for instance.
No, not at all. It doesn't negate the broader category, but it allows us to categorize someone in a way that feels immediately more useful, perhaps for predicting behavior or, role fulfillment in a given situation.
I think the clearest way to see how subtypes function is through their valence, the sort of positive or negative spin they carry.
Yeah.
Take older adults as an example. Even within that single age group, we see an immediate cognitive split, right?
Absolutely. It's quite stark. We have positive subtypes readily available, like the golden ager or the perfect grandparent individuals we associate with, say, wisdom, patience, warmth.
Yeah, the positive image.
But just as readily available in memory are the negative subtypes. The shrew curmudgeon, maybe, or the severely impaired elder.
Wow.
The fact that these highly distinct mental slots exist shows that our categorization system isn't just for classification. It's designed to prepare an immediate, effective, and emotional response. #tag B bottom-up influences what we see.
Okay, so if that's the basic structure, how does the input actually get in? Let's talk about bottom-up processing. This is driven purely by the observable characteristics of the person right in front of us.
Right. What you see is what you get initially. And the speed of this process is heavily influenced by something called prototypicality.
Prototypicality, meaning how much someone fits the standard mental image.
Exactly. It's the extent to which an individual's physical features match the mental template, the sort of ideal example of a social category in your head.
So the more someone looks like that template, the faster you classify them.
Precisely. Research confirms this with the racial phenotypical bias. Categorization is quicker, it's easier for people who physically align very closely with that typical mental image of their group.
And if they don't fit the mold.
Well, if someone deviates significantly from that internal template, the processing actually slows down considerably. The brain has to work harder.
And this instant visual sorting relies on, well, surprisingly detailed physical cues. We rely heavily on body shape, for instance.
Yeah, body cues like
Yep.
overall size, the way someone moves, their shape, these are primary indicators of group membership, especially for biological sex.
How so?
We seem to unconsciously rely on cues like narrower waists or smaller shoulder widths as key inputs when processing biological sex. But we use these visual ratios almost instantly without thinking.
But what really stands out to me is the surprising granularity of the facial categorization research.
Yeah.
We know, for example, that baby faces are automatically seen as maybe weaker or more submissive.
Right.
But the research has pinpointed really specific, tiny features that influence judgments about things like aggression and trust.
Yeah.
That's kind of wild.
This is where it gets truly fascinating and maybe a little unnerving because these judgments are happening entirely unconsciously. Take the width to height ratio of the face.
Okay, the ratio of how wide to how tall the face is.
Yes, and studies have found that people whose faces have a larger width to height ratio are instantly perceived as less friendly, less trustworthy, and crucially more aggressive than those with a smaller ratio.
Wow. So you're making these high-stakes social judgments based on a measurement we aren't even aware we're making. Yeah. Is there any theory why a wider face signals aggression?
Well, one hypothesis connects it back to dominance and maybe evolutionary signals. A wider facial structure can sometimes be an indirect visual cue related to higher circulating testosterone levels during development.
Oh.
Now, whether that's actually accurate for the individual or not, the cognitive shortcut seems to interpret that width as a potential signal of dominance or, in the social context, aggression. It's a sort of brutishly utilitarian mechanism for instant threat assessment.
A quick and dirty assessment.
Very quick, very dirty.
Now, what happens to this super efficient system when the visual data isn't clear? When the cues are ambiguous, when someone doesn't neatly fit into one of those boxes?
Yeah, that ambiguity throws a wrench in the works. It causes the perceiver to feel a bit off balance, as the research puts it, and the categorization process slows way down. And crucially, research highlights something called the minority bias in categorization. When the cues are ambiguous, perceivers tend to default. They tend to classify the person as a member of the minority or the socially subordinate group.
Wait, really? That's a profound finding. The default assumption, when things are unclear, leans towards the subordinate group.
Yes. It seems that people with ambiguous features are categorized as belonging to a minority group until a very high percentage of their features are stereotypically white or, stereotypically part of the dominant group in that context.
So the implication is that the unmarked or dominant category, often the ingroup, requires a really high burden of visual proof.
That seems to be the case. Ambiguity tends to get resolved by defaulting to the marginalized slot, which of course can unintentionally reinforce existing social hierarchies, even in just a moment of cognitive confusion. ##C top-down influences what we expect.
Okay, so if bottom-up is driven by sight, then top-down processing is the flip side. This is categorization based on our prior knowledge stored in memory, our expectations about the world.
Exactly. What we expect to see influences what we see, or at least how we categorize it.
The classic thought experiment illustrates this perfectly, doesn't it? A woman describes her hectic day managing resources, organizing schedules, dealing with stressed people.
Right.
How you interpret those actions, her tasks, her whole persona, depends entirely on whether you were told beforehand that she's a librarian or a waitress.
That prior label, the existing stereotype, completely filters the incoming information. It acts as a template for categorization.
And this affects recognition, too.
Yes. For example, research shows that if a face displays gender atypical characteristics associated with stereotypes about gay men, our categorization of them as gay is actually more accurate than for a face displaying gender-typical characteristics associated with straight men.
So we're using the stereotype, the expectation, to guide the recognition process itself.
We are. The expectation shapes the perception.
And of course, situational context is a huge modifier here. It can completely override a basic category if the situation makes something else stand out more.
Absolutely. People tend to focus on what makes another person different in that specific context. So if you see an Asian woman in a group that's overwhelmingly made up of Asian men,
Her gender becomes the salient feature.
precisely, you're much more likely to categorize her primarily as a woman in that moment. Her gender stands out because of the situational backdrop. It's the unique feature there.
It really highlights the sort of brutally utilitarian nature of this system again. It picks what's most useful now. Which reminds me, our immediate goals matter too, right?
Definitely. Interaction goals dictate which category gets activated. If you have an accuracy goal, say, you really need to know exactly who this person is professionally, you might categorize a woman in uniform very specifically as a police officer.
Okay.
But if your goal is simpler, maybe just estimating her height or size, you're more likely to activate the broader category of woman and maybe ignore the uniform detail. The goal dictates which mental slot is most useful in that moment.
And finally, how does pre-existing prejudice filter into this top-down process? Does it make people rely more on categories?
It seems to. Research suggests that racially prejudiced individuals often exhibit a cognitive tendency to pay much more attention to race compared to other categories.
They prioritize it.
Yes, they seem to actively utilize existing group stereotypes as a way to reduce ambiguity, especially when they encounter someone who doesn't clearly fit a pre-existing mold. For them, prejudice isn't just an attitude, it seems to function as a sort of high-priority lens used for instant classification, simplifying the world along those prejudice lines.
Okay, so the categorization engine is humming along, sorting everyone, and the immediate result is the most fundamental cognitive distinction possible. Ingroups and outgroups.
Us versus them.
Exactly. And this simple mental split, just creating these two buckets, has profound and immediate consequences for how we perceive and treat others.
And maybe the most startling discovery in social psychology, the one that really demonstrates the speed and, frankly, the irrationality of this process, is the minimal group paradigm.
Ah, yes, this one's fascinating. It showed you don't need history or interaction or shared beliefs or anything meaningful to create this bias.
Right. Absolutely nothing meaningful. We're talking about creating groups based on truly arbitrary, completely meaningless criteria.
Like what? What do they use?
Oh, things like asking participants to estimate the number of dots on a screen and then randomly telling them they were overestimators or underestimators, or showing them abstract paintings and assigning them to groups based on whether they supposedly preferred the art of Kandinsky or Klee.
Wow. And the group members never met.
Never interacted. The variable used for grouping was utterly inconsequential, yet the mental split yes versus them was instantaneous.
So what happened next? How did people behave once they knew their, completely random group membership?
They immediately showed in-group bias when given the chance to allocate resources like points or even small amounts of money. Participants consistently decided their own group was better. They allocated more money or points to the abstract in-group members, people they'd never met, defined by a meaningless label, than they did to the outgroup members.
And crucially, they did this even if it cost their own group overall, right?
Okay.
It wasn't about maximizing their own gain.
That's the absolutely key finding. They were often willing to make decisions that sacrificed the maximum possible overall financial gain just to ensure that the in-group received relatively more than the out-group.
So it's less about hating the outgroup.
Exactly. This demonstrates that the bias seems driven more by in-group love, this powerful, almost primal desire to reward your own, than by active out-group hate, or a desire to actively harm the other group. This simple feeling of belonging, even belonging to something completely arbitrary, instantly overrides purely utilitarian or rational logic. Hashtag B perception biases of them.
Okay, so once that flimsy barrier goes up, the outgroup starts being viewed through this, warped cognitive lens.
Yeah.
The first major consequence is the outgroup homogeneity effect.
Right.
We see our in-group as highly diverse, full of unique individuals, but we drastically underestimate the differences among outgroup members. They all seem kind of the same.
That's it, exactly. For us, the in-group contains multitudes, right? Every single person is seen as unique, with their own quirks and qualities. But for them, we tend to believe they all share similar traits, similar social roles, probably similar lives.
We fail to see their individuality. We just group them too tightly.
We do. We lose the nuance.
Why does that happen? Is it just that we see our own group more often?
That's definitely part of it. We interact more frequently with our own group members, so we simply gather more specific, unique data points about them over time.
Makes sense.
But there's also a strong psychological motivation at play. We generally want to maintain our own distinctiveness within our in-group. We look for ways we're different from our peers, to assert our individuality.
Right. We don't want to be just another face in our own crowd.
Exactly. But we don't typically feel that same psychological need to differentiate outgroup members from each other. There's less motivation to see their unique qualities.
Hmm. This feels like it feeds directly into that well-known phenomena, the cross-racial identification bias. The feeling that people of other races all look alike.
It's closely related, yes. Research confirms this bias occurs, especially when our cognitive resources are limited.
Meaning when we're stressed or distracted.
Exactly. If you're stressed, multitasking, or just not consciously dedicating your full attention to processing the features of an outgroup member, you tend to pay less attention to their unique facial characteristics.
And the result?
Poorer recognition memory later on. You don't encode the individual details as effectively, only the broad category information. So later, it's harder to distinguish individuals you encountered briefly.
And then there's this defensive move, this kind of tight policing of the border around the in-group. What's that called again? In-group over-exclusion?
Yes, in-group over-exclusion. This is the tendency to draw a really sharp, rigid circle around who counts as us.
And the goal is purely defensive.
Highly defensive, it seems. The goal is basically to avoid accidentally extending in-group privileges, like resources, trust, or status, to the wrong people, meaning potential outgroup members trying to pass. It's a mechanism for protecting what the group perceives as its own.
And this is more common in certain people.
Research indicates it's far more common among individuals who score high on measures of ethnocentrism, which demonstrates that existing ideology and attitudes strongly dictate just how tightly those in-group boundaries are drawn and policed. #C, explaining behavior, attribution, and dehumanization.
Okay, the real moment of truth for this mental split us versus them comes when we start explaining why people do things, their successes, their failures. This takes us to the ultimate attribution error.
Yes. This is essentially a perfect cognitive formula for generating and maintaining self-serving bias at the group level.
It completely changes the narrative based purely on group membership, doesn't it?
Completely. Let's map it out. When someone in the in-group performs a negative behavior, say, someone in your group cuts you off in traffic. Right. We almost automatically assume it can be explained by situational factors. They must have been in a rush, maybe they had an emergency, perhaps the sun was in their eyes, it was the situation.
But if someone from the out-group performs that exact same negative action, cuts you off in the same way,
instantly, that behavior is attributed to their internal stable characteristics. They are inherently careless, or maybe they're kind or just aggressive drivers. The negative outcome is framed as reflecting an internal permanent flaw in them or their group.
Wow. And the attribution flips completely when we look at positive action.
It flips perfectly. If an outgroup member performs a positive action, let's say they win an award or do something impressive, we tend to attribute it to external factors like luck, special advantages, or unusual situational characteristics. It was a fluke, basically. It won't happen again. They were just in the right place at the right time, or maybe they had an unfair help.
Whereas if an in-group member achieves the same success, wins the same award,
oh, that's attributed directly to their stable personality traits, their genius, their hard work, their inherent talent, their group superiority. It's seen as confirmation that our group is inherently good, capable, and deserving.
So this attribution error just constantly reinforces the in-group's positive self-view and confirms negative views of the outgroup, no matter what actually happens.
Precisely. It ensures that almost all incoming social information gets filtered through this biased lens, strengthening the divide.
Okay, now we have to talk about the most extreme and, frankly, the most disturbing consequence of this whole categorization process: dehumanization. This isn't just about negative stereotypes, it's something deeper.
It's a profound cognitive shift, yes. Dehumanization means that outgroups are cognitively stripped of the basic human, physical, and emotional features that we readily attribute to our in-group.
And research indicates this isn't just like a philosophical idea. It affects actual brain processing.
That's what's so chilling. It's not just metaphorical. Studies suggest that information about dehumanized group members is processed differently in the brain. When we fully dehumanize a group, it appears the brain literally may not encode them as human beings in the same way it does in-group members or even other non-dehumanized outgroups.
That's hard to fathom. And the immediate effect is severing empathy.
It seems to immediately sever the empathic bonds that are necessary for normal social connection and moral concern.
Creating a vacuum of empathy?
Exactly. The consequence is indifference, callousness, a fundamental inattention to the suffering or pain of others in that group. This mental shift seems almost necessary to open the door to outright cruelty, dislike, or hatred, because you've essentially moved the target outside the bounds of shared humanity, outside your moral universe.
And the research connects this cognitive tendency directly to real-world policy support, using something called the Ascent Dehumanization Scale.
Yes, that scale asks people to rate various social groups on a scale from 0, representing less evolved or less human, to 100, representing fully human. And the ratings correlate strongly and troublingly with policy views. The example often cited is stark. Individuals who rated certain groups, like Muslims, lower on this dehumanization scale, were statistically more likely to support negative restrictive treatment of those groups. Such as supporting policies like prohibiting Muslim travel to the U.S. It demonstrates this terrifying real-world trajectory where a cognitive failure, failing to see the full humanity in others, translates directly into tangible support for social exclusion and potential harm.
Okay, we've laid out the stark consequences, the immediate biases that result from just sorting people into us and them. But before we can really think about dismantling these, we need to backtrack a bit.
Yeah.
Where does the content of the stereotype, the actual beliefs, come from? How are these rigid ideas manufactured in the first place? Hashtag theory, sources of stereotype learning.
Well, the sources we looked at outline a few primary channels. First, and maybe most obviously, is social transmission.
Meaning we just learn them from people around us.
Yeah, we learn them from parents, from peers, from our wider social environment. Kids soak these things up. Second, the media, which we'll definitely dig into more shortly, acts as a hugely powerful source and reinforcer.
Okay.
And third, our own direct observations of the world around us. We see patterns, or think we see patterns, and draw conclusions. These three really combine to form the initial belief template. Hashtag be psychological drivers.
So within our own observations, there seem to be two specific psychological drivers that are really good at turning what might be a neutral observation into a rigid, pervasive belief. The first one is social role theory.
Right. This theory suggests that we observe the highly specific social roles people occupy in society. You see nurses, construction workers, teachers, CEOs, whatever. We see the behaviors and traits associated with performing that role successfully. And then we incorrectly associate the characteristics of the role itself with the individuals who happen to hold it. We assume the role defines their inherent personality.
So if we observe that most nurses we encounter seem kind and nurturing in their job,
we mistakenly generalize and assume that women who are disproportionately represented in nursing must possess inherent kindness and nurturing traits, regardless of whether they are nurses or not, or what situation they're in.
it's a misattribution error.
Exactly. And it's driven largely by a fundamental cognitive bias called the correspondence bias.
Yeah, sir.
That's our pervasive tendency to assume that another person's actions reflect their core personality, their stable disposition, rather than considering the powerful influence of the situational demands of their role or context. If someone acts nurturing because their job literally requires it, we overlook the situation and just assume they are a nurturing person. That assumption then gets baked into a stereotypic belief about the group that commonly occupies that role.
Okay, that makes sense. The second major psychological driver, and this one feels like a really powerful engine of cognitive error, is illusory correlation. This explains how we basically invent links between things that aren't actually linked or aren't strongly linked.
Yeah, this one is fascinating and really insidious. It's the incorrect linking of two characteristics in our minds. We tend to overestimate the relationship between two categories, especially when distinctive information like undesirable behavior, which is often less common, is associated with a distinctive group, like a minority group.
And the result is these inaccurate associations get lodged firmly in memory.
And they are notoriously difficult to change, even when you're presented with contradictory evidence later.
This paradigm is so counterintuitive, I think we really need to walk through the classic experiment, the one sometimes called the numbers game, to see how the mind can create a firm belief basically out of thin air, just from skewed perception.
Definitely. It's a powerful illustration.
All right.
In that classic experiment, participants read a series of sentences describing various behaviors performed by members of two fictional groups. Let's call them majority group A and minority group B. Now, crucially, the setup was rigged so that the ratio of desirable or good behaviors to undesirable or bad behaviors was exactly the same for both groups. Let's say it was 70% desirable behaviors and 30% undesirable behaviors for Group A and for Group B.
So proportionally, they behaved identically well or badly.
Proportionally, yes. But because Group A was the majority, participants read more sentences about them overall. So maybe they read about 18 desirable behaviors and 8 undesirable behaviors for Group A.
Okay, more data points still.
All right. Whereas for the minority Group B, maintaining that same 70-30 ratio, participants might have read about only, say, 9 desirable behaviors and 4 undesirable behaviors. Fewer examples overall, but the same proportion of bad behavior.
Got it. So where does the illusion come in?
Here's where the cognitive error kicks in. Undesirable behaviors, the negative actions, are generally less frequent in the descriptions overall, only 30%. They stand out a bit just by being less common. Now, when an already infrequent event, an undesirable behavior, is performed by a member of an already distinctive or infrequent group, minority Group B, that pairing becomes psychologically doubly distinctive. It's highly memorable. It sticks in the mind more.
So the single unusual negative behavior by a minority member just pops out more strongly, it's more salient than the equally proportionally rare negative behavior by a member of the much larger majority group.
Precisely. The mind latches onto and overemphasizes the co-occurrence of two things that are relatively distinctive: the smaller group and the less common negative behavior.
What the outcome?
Despite the fact that the actual rate of undesirable behavior was identical for both groups, participants consistently formed a more positive impression of the majority Group A. They subsequently overestimated the frequency with which the minority Group B performed negative behaviors. They created a negative stereotype based purely on this illusory correlation. It demonstrates powerfully that merely observing a few negative but highly distinctive behaviors by a minority group can be enough to produce firm, negative stereotypes that directly contradict the statistical reality they were presented with.
Okay, so if our internal cognitive system is already prone to these kinds of errors, like the illusory correlation, then the external world, especially language and media, acts as this powerful transmission belt, constantly reinforcing those internal shortcuts day in and day out. #A media reinforcement.
Oh, absolutely. Media exposure is central to how we acquire, maintain, and strengthen stereotypic beliefs. For starters, media naturally focuses overwhelmingly on powerful groups compared to subordinate groups. They just get more airtime, more visibility.
Right.
And when subordinate groups are represented, their portrayals are often, well, almost universally stereotypic, fitting neatly into those pre-existing boxes.
And the research confirms a direct link here. More media equals stronger stereotypes.
Yes, there's a clear correlation. Studies consistently show that the more media exposure people have, especially to traditional forms of media, the stronger the stereotypic beliefs they tend to hold.
And the biases are pervasive, starting sometimes with just the sheer invisibility of certain groups.
Definitely. Consider the numbers on representation. In major cinematic releases, for example, studies find there are consistently about 2 male characters featured for every single female character. That's a huge skew.
Yeah.
And sexual minorities often remain nearly invisible in major roles. One analysis found only about 1.4% of major characters were identifiable as gay men, and less than 1% combined were lesbian, bisexual, or transgender characters. The media simply presents a very incomplete and distorted picture of who actually exists in the world.
And advertising seems particularly bad at reinforcing traditional gender roles.
Aggressively so, yes. In advertising, women are very often portrayed either at home or in roles conveying dependence or being focused on appearance, whereas men are consistently shown in professional settings, in positions of power, or engaging in action-oriented activities.
And race in advertising.
Similar patterns. Despite the increasing diversity of, say, the American population, white people still appear far more frequently than members of any other ethnic group in U.S. advertisements. This visually reinforces the assumption of white as the default or unmarked citizen.
And the impact of this constant reinforcement isn't just passive, right? There's that classic study where media didn't just reflect stereotypes, it seemed to actively start prescribing behavior, especially for women.
You mean the study involving undergraduate women viewing different types of commercials?
Yeah, the one.
That was a powerful demonstration. After viewing ads that depicted women and men in those highly traditional, stereotypical roles,
Uh-huh.
the women participants subsequently wrote essays describing their own future lives much more frequently in terms of being homemakers, rather than pursuing career women paths compared to women who saw non-traditional ads or no ads.
And the men.
Crucially, the men's descriptions of their future lives and career expectations were entirely unchanged, regardless of which type of commercial they viewed.
Wow. So it shows that media can act as this potent external force, not just reflecting, but actively setting limits and prescribing expected life paths, particularly for already subordinate groups. Hashtag tag day language and communication bias.
And then there's language. Language is this silent, constant enforcer of stereotypes because it embeds them right into our everyday vocabulary and even our grammatical structures.
How so? Like using qualifiers.
Exactly. We often use unnecessary qualifiers that mark non-traditional group members, immediately making them stand out as exceptions to a rule: woman doctor, black dentist, male nurse.
Right. The qualifier implies that the default doctor is male, the default dentist is white, the default nurse is female. It forces the non-traditional identifier to carry this sort of asterisk.
Precisely. Similarly, there's the man-first principle, which is deeply ingrained in English usage, though maybe starting to shift slowly.
You mean like brothers and sisters, kings and queens, Mr. and Mrs.?
Yes. The male term tends to precede the female term in these pairings, which subtly reinforces a kind of social hierarchy or precedence.
And beyond just grammar, we use common, often quite loaded, expressions that are explicitly tied to stereotypes about other nationalities or groups.
Oh, constantly. And these are often highly negative, drawing on old, sometimes derogatory beliefs. Things like Dutch treat implying stinginess, or it's all Greek to me implying incomprehensibility, or even, excuse my French, used to apologize for swearing, linking French language, or people with vulgarity. These common phrases normalize and perpetuate historic stereotypic beliefs without us even thinking about it.
This also includes more coded, maybe modern language too.
Yeah.
Right, like the use of mock Spanish.
Yes, that's a good example. Mock Spanish often conveys subtly denigrating messages about Latin Americans through phrases that seem playful but can be quite harmful, things like adding O to English words like el chipo, or using phrases like no problemo, or even media catchphrases like hasta la vista, baby.
Yeah.
This kind of language normalizes negative or simplistic associations about a group, and it filters very easily into mass media as well, making it seem acceptable.
I think one of the most perhaps surprising and pervasive examples of language bias is the instant negative judgment that can be associated with simply having a perceived non-standard accent.
Accent bias is a huge, huge factor in social judgment, often operating completely below our conscious awareness. People with accents perceived as non-standard in a given context are consistently rated in studies as less intelligent, less competent, less suitable for high-status jobs.
Wow.
And sometimes, depressingly, even as more likely to be guilty of a crime in mock juror studies. The specific perception, however, really depends on the accent and the cultural context.
Can you give us those examples again? The U.S. versus German context.
Sure. In the U.S., for instance, a Southern accent is often rated lower on intelligence or sophistication, but it's simultaneously rated higher on social warmth, seen as richer, friendlier, more polite.
Okay, so mixed bag, but still a bias.
A mixed bag, exactly. Contrast that with studies in Germany, where speakers with accents from regions like Berlin, Saxony, or Bavaria are often perceived more negatively across the board, seen as less competent, and suffering lower perceived hireability for professional jobs. In the U.S. example, the bias has a sort of warm but dumb flavor. In the German example, it seems more directly linked to perceptions of competence and professional status.
Isn't it amazing how much weight we put on accent? And finally, our own communication habits ensure these beliefs persist, right?
Yeah.
Because we act as sort of cognitive gatekeepers for information.
Precisely. Research on communication patterns shows that people are significantly more likely to share information that is stereotype consistent than information that is stereotype inconsistent.
So we pass on the stuff that fits the mold.
Yes. When we talk about groups or members of groups, we unconsciously tend to select and transmit the details that confirm the existing group beliefs. This ensures that the stereotype remains reinforced and stable within our social network, largely regardless of the actual, more complex reality outside. We filter the information flow. ##C, the accuracy question.
Okay, we have spent the vast majority of our time here detailing all the errors, the biases, the misperceptions, the harmful consequences. But we absolutely must address the ultimate nagging question. Do stereotypes contain any kernel of truth? Is there any accuracy at all to these broad generalizations?
It's a critical question, and the research generally acknowledges that many stereotypic beliefs are, as the sources put it, not totally unfounded and are often based in social reality. Meaning, they often contain what's referred to as a kernel of truth. This suggests that some generalizations can be statistically descriptive of a whole group, on average.
Okay, give us an example of a descriptive kernel of truth.
Well, the straightforward physical example is often used. The descriptive statement that men are, on average, taller than women. Statistically, looking at the overall groups, this is true.
Right, it's a measurable average difference between the two groups.
Exactly. It's a purely descriptive statistical observation about the groups as a whole. Now, the critical problem, the real danger, isn't necessarily whether this descriptive observation is accurate or inaccurate at the group level. The critical danger arises when stereotypes shift from being merely descriptive to becoming prescriptive.
Ah, that's the absolutely essential distinction, isn't it? The jump from observing what is on average to demanding what should be for individuals.
Precisely. Think about the professional roles we discussed earlier with social role theory. A descriptive observation might be, statistically, in this country, a large majority of elementary school teachers are women. That's a statement of observation about current distribution. The prescriptive shift turns this observation into a rule, an expectation. Women should be elementary school teachers, and maybe aren't suited for other roles. And men should be engineers, and perhaps aren't suited for teaching young children.
Right. That prescriptive statement uses the existing distribution, which might have complex historical causes, as a justification for limiting individual choices, aspirations, and opportunities based purely on group membership.
Exactly. It dictates behavior. It dictates where certain groups belong, where they are welcome, and where they are not. It takes a snapshot of reality, maybe even a statistically accurate one at the group level, and tries to freeze it, turning it into a rigid social order.
So the real harm of a stereotype isn't just that it's often factually false or oversimplified.
Right. The deeper harm often lies in how we allow the few observations that might have some statistical basis, that kernel of truth, to become these ironclad rules for judging individuals and restricting human potential. That shift from is to ought is the crucial moment. A statistical generalization becomes a potent tool of social control and limitation. #tag outro.
Wow. We have covered some massive ground today. We've really followed the entire life cycle of a social stereotype, haven't we? From the micro-level machinery of instant categorization and even facial recognition, all the way up to the macro-level impact of mass media and the subtleties of everyday language. To quickly try and synthesize, the process starts with the brain's necessary, almost unavoidable efficiency of categorization, part one.
Right, the basic sorting.
But that instantaneous sorting, immediately, almost inevitably, creates bias favoring the in-group and potentially suspicion or negativity toward the out-group, part two.
The US versus them split happens fast.
And then that initial bias is just relentlessly reinforced by our own cognitive errors, like the illusory correlation and the constant transmission and confirmation through language and media, parts 3 and 4. It's a powerful cycle.
It really is. And the value, I think, of this kind of deep dive for you, the listener, is understanding that these fundamental processes, things like the minimal group paradigm or the ultimate attribution error, are largely automatic and often operate completely outside our conscious awareness.
Yeah.
Just knowing this, knowing how the machinery works, allows you hopefully to start spotting your own automatic assumptions in action. You might catch yourself when you explain an in-group member's failure as just bad luck, but instantly attribute an out-group member's identical failure to some internal permanent flaw. That knowledge gives you the cognitive friction needed to maybe pause, question, and interrupt that automatic process.
Okay, so let's leave you with a final thought to maybe mull over this week, building on that last point about accuracy. We established that the critical difference lies between a descriptive statement and a prescriptive one. That difference determines whether a stereotype is just a potentially flawed statistical observation or a genuinely harmful social tool.
So maybe think about the impact of that rigidity. Is the core problem with stereotypes primarily that they're often factually inaccurate or overgeneralized? Or is the deeper, more insidious issue that we permit even those few observations that might hold a kernel of truth, those descriptive statistical averages, to become rigid, limiting, and often punitive rules for how individual people should behave, what they should aspire to, and what opportunities they should be allowed to pursue?
A powerful question.
So as you move through your week, maybe just pay attention. How often do you see or hear stereotypes being used not just to describe the world as it might be, however imperfectly, but to actively prescribe future action, to limit possibilities, to enforce conformity based on group identity? It's something worth noticing.